Hey there, advanced procrastinators. Let's get into this and do study guide chapter number 16 on the Great Depression. So hopefully you've already answered these study guide questions going in there, guys. And as we do the video today, let's please check out and answer the checking for understanding questions, please. I believe that this chapter is going to be one of the more important chapters for the AP exam this year. So let's talk about the Great Depression and the causes of the Great Depression. Why did it happen? Because it's besides the fact of the stock market crash causing it, that was just an indicator that there was a Great Depression. The number one reason was an unequal distribution of wealth. In the 1920s, all Americans are making more money, but the rich had even more money than before. And when they get too much money, the money does not circulate down. You can see in the upper left-hand image there, the car on the top, that is a Duesenberg. That is a car of the extremely wealthy. Compared to the left, what a Model T is. So yes, people had access to cars, but a completely different quality of car. Another problem is going to happen by the late 20s is going to be underconsumption. All those items at the beginning of the 20s that Americans could afford with credit, all of a sudden they could not afford those anymore because they were putting their money back into their credit. Their wages did not go up. So what ended up happening is that companies started letting workers go, causing people to have even less money to spend and creating a circular effect of less money, less consumption. And then lastly, people were in the stock market. And the reason why the stock market affected people so much is something called borrowing on margin. You could borrow 90% of what you put down in value. So if you put $1,000 down, you could borrow $9,000 to buy stocks. Now, this worked as long as the stocks went up. But if it went down, your stocks, you couldn't pay back the $9,000. And what this caused in the stock market crash is an overinflation of prices. The stocks went too high. And then when the stock market crashed, that money that people borrowed on margin, say that $9,000, all of a sudden, I can't pay that back. And what ended up happening is the banks ended up going out of business, taking people's money with them. Now, why would these three factors impact enough Americans enough to cause the worst economic crisis in world history? And the answer to this is basically it all comes down to access to money for as many people as possible in America. Ordinary Americans lacked access to money in order to buy new products and keep the economy flowing. What we have right now in America with COVID-19 is we have an active government that's trying to give stimulus checks to people and loans to people to make sure that people still have money so that the economy does not shut down when people have all been forced to go home and not go to work. It was the opposite in the 1930s or late 1920s, where all of a sudden all that money just dried up. Now, the president of the United States at this time was Herbert Hoover. And his plan to deal with the Depression, being a Republican, was basically it was volunteerism, right? Charity should be provided, not the government, and localism. Let the local areas deal with it. And we're seeing this also with the COVID-19 incident right now where every state and every county is all trying to make their own rules about what to do. And the problem is there's been a lot of confusion. Good example is in Huntington Beach. And the beach is open in Huntington Beach and people protesting when the governor suddenly shut it down, right? Because in some places the beaches are open, some places the beaches aren't open, and people are getting upset by that. So rather than there being a unified national front about how to confront this, it was local and it was supposed to be voluntary. Also, Hoover said the problem is if the federal government gets involved, right, it will take away from the determination of Americans, right? It's called rugged individualism. America is a country founded on hard work and sacrifice and determination, and the government starts giving money to people that will make people lazy when they're unemployed. Now, what you need to understand here is, first off, what does this mean to be unemployed? Would Americans, if they get a check from the government, not want to go to work because they're unemployed? And the first thing is unemployment means people want a job, but they cannot find a job. Okay. And the unemployment rate was 25%, right? And also business failures are an all-time high. All right. So basically, number one, if you offered people a job in America back then, they probably would have taken it because they were desperate. But the problem was people couldn't even get a job, right? And what you need to understand here is think about this, remember this. What was it that happened in the 1920s before the causes with the federal government? What direction the federal government go in the 1920s that helped to create this problem? And this is what's going to set Hoover back is the government in the 20s ignored the responsibility to protect people from business taking advantage of them. We had a return to laissez-faire. So rather than having a government that helped to regulate the economy, we had an a government that allowed business to do anything it needed to do. And when this crash happened, the federal government was unprepared to help when things went bad. Now, one thing that Hoover did that was instructive and did help was called the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And what he did in this case is the government loaned money to banks and businesses, just like what's happened with the coronavirus right now and the Paycheck Protection Program, where the government has given money to banks to then give to small businesses, right? Now, what ends up happening here is that the problem with it was it went to banks and businesses. And this is happening in America right now as well, too, where a lot of the money doesn't get down to the people. People, individuals needed money. And if people had just been given money, they would have spent that money. Banks and businesses, in an effort to try to save their own business, they kept the money. So they didn't kick it into the paychecks of their workers. They instead still fired their workers and kept a lot of the money in order to stay in business. Now, number one is, why was it important to save banks in the first place? Like, actually, that was a good idea. You do need to give money to the banks. And the reason is, if a bank went out of business, all the depositors' money was lost as well too. The problem with the RFC is that banks continued to go out of business, right? As much of the money was already invested in the stock market and was lost. Also, people don't trust the banks. So people are taking their money out of the banks, causing the banks to still go under. So basically, all the RFC was a band-aid on a monster cut that's continuing to bleed. Now, a top tip to recognize about Hoover, though, being the worst president in American history, he really wasn't the worst president in American history. In fact, he was an able and experienced public servant who was prepared to be president during this moment. In World War I, he was in charge of the Food Administration, right? He was a Secretary of Labor before he became president. He was a smart guy ready to do his job as president. The problem was that this crisis was so big that the standard way of trying to solve an economic crisis, which was basically just letting it run its course, it was too big. America was so devastated that people were on the verge of literally burning stuff. Maybe this capitalism thing and democracy doesn't work. Maybe we should experiment with communism, right? And this crisis needed a plan regarding government aid and involvement that bordered on socialism. And the Republicans at this time, the people sitting on the upper left-hand corner, right, they were all the business leaders of America, and they didn't understand that the way to solve this thing was not to give the money just to the businesses, it was to get it to the people. And right, and a last example of Hoover looking like he didn't know what he was doing was with the bonus army. And the bonus army was World War I veterans who demanded their bonus checks early, which were due in the 1940s from World War I, right? So they marched on Washington, D.C., saying, look, we need the money now or we're going to be dead. Now, Hoover's response was he sent in the army with tear gas. Okay. Now, this event basically catalyzes the fact that Hoover will not be reelected president of the United States. Besides, even though at this time he had the RFC, Hoover Dam is actually being built and things like that, he's trying to deal with this. How did this event hurt Hoover's reelection chances? And the answer is he looked like he did not care about ordinary Americans. Think about who veterans are. They are the most respected people in America. And these are veterans from World War I who went overseas and fought in the bloodiest war in the history of the world, right? So basically, his actions against a respected group in America made Americans think, wow, what's this guy think about me if I'm just a regular, ordinary person? And that's where we get Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, who replaces Hoover as president of the United States. Now, his plan is called the New Deal, right? And this is his program designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform where the government's going to take responsibility for the good of the country. Okay. Now, Roosevelt is arguably the greatest president in American history, right? And it wasn't just that what he did and things like that. He was a president that a lot of Americans supported. He was cheerful, cordial, attentive, right? The press listened to him, right? A lot of Americans put their hope in Roosevelt as president. But an interesting thing to keep in mind, right, is that Roosevelt had polio at this time. It was an affliction that happened to a lot of Americans, and when he was in his mid-20s, he lost the ability to walk. And if you think about it, right, would we elect a handicapped president today in America? And the answer is probably no. We probably wouldn't. We want our president to be tall. We want them to look good. We want them to fit the part. I believe in every presidential election except for two, the taller candidates always win, right? And what allowed FDR to hide his handicap back then is the most popular way that people got their information was on the radio or a newspaper. Also, you have a press corps that was actually very supportive of the president's ideas and was willing to get his message out, right? And they could always have him sitting down if there was a camera. So sitting at a table signing the letters, driving a car, okay? And what's important to realize is, wow, what was it about his polio that helped FDR during the Great Depression? A lot of Americans felt FDR felt their pain, but FDR is from one of the wealthier families in America. His family's still rich when this happens. What was it about polio that helped him empathize with Americans? And the answer is, being that he used to be able to walk and overnight basically could not walk, he understood the economic pain that people went through, where one day they were economically stable and the next time they're broke and they're unsure about how they're going to survive and get along after that. So it gave him a lot of insight and empathy into the American people. Now, when he takes over, you have to have a plan, right? That's the New Deal. And what are the three R's? How do you get Americans into a better place? Right now, the three R's is goals to end the depression. The first one is relief for the unemployed and the needy. Get checks to Americans, literally welfare. In COVID-19, these are the $1,200 stimulus checks that some of your families might have received. Another one is recovery. How do you turn this country around? How do you get jobs for people? Okay, that's the country opening itself up now, trying, let's get this recovery going and let's get some people back to work, even though this disease is still out there. And reform. How can we prevent another Great Depression happening? Well, that's what we're looking at right now in the COVID-19, right? How can we prevent another pandemic from happening here by trying to find a cure for this or herd immunity, right? Now, what you need to understand here is what's changed about the role of government in America. And basically, the government is now going to be a safety net for people in need. It's no longer going to be laissez-faire. So if you're in a bad state, the government will come in and help you out. Now, identify these new deal agencies. Make sure you memorize several of them, okay? You had Glass-Steagall and the FDIC. Now, what this did is insured people's monies in the bank. So now if the bank goes out of business, your money didn't disappear with it, right? And that was one of the biggest problems at the beginning of the Depression is with the stock market crash, banks crashed, and people's money vanished overnight. Now the government will insure your money if you put it in a bank, and this allows for the circulation of money. FARA is going to provide money for unemployment relief. Yes, basically like welfare checks. TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, it's going to build dams in Tennessee. And what this is going to do, it's going to create jobs building the dam and also maybe possibly create a tourism industry with the lakes. And when it's done, there will be electricity for people in one of the poor areas of America. And then you have the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put young people to work on conservation projects up in the woods, planting trees and building campgrounds. One of the key reasons for this, right, was to get young men who might be the ones who be most predisposed to get into trouble, to send them into a place where they could not get into any trouble and offer jobs for married adult men, maybe. And the SEC, which is regulating the stock market to prevent another crash. Now, analyze why the government felt it necessary to take the time and establish these organizations to help create jobs rather than just actually what would have been easier is to just send everybody a check or universal basic income. Now, the answer was FDR's plan was to create jobs. By having jobs, you give people dignity through work. People feel good about working for their money, right? When you give people a handout, it just reminds them how bad they are off and that they can't provide for themselves. By providing a job, it makes people feel they have an ownership in trying to make their lives better, okay? But also keep this in mind. Here's a top tip, guys. No, the New Deal, and you'll see this in just a second, did not end the Great Depression, right? World War II did, okay? So it was important to make sure that these programs allowed Americans to stay somewhat upbeat and positive in a time of incredible uncertainty. What we're going through right now with COVID-19 is basically the next time we've had this kind of uncertainty about what the future is going to be. And a lot of us can see with the protests that are going on right now that a lot of people are starting to get frustrated and angry about when we will go back to our normal lives. With the New Deal, the idea of these programs was to prevent people from starting to get that level of anxiety and frustration where people want to go out there and start burning stuff. Now, opponents of the New Deal. Now, these three opponents, right, are actually liberal opponents. They feel that the New Deal did not go far enough, and it could have gone farther because, as I said, remember, the New Deal did not end the Depression. You have Huey Long, and his idea was share our wealth. And the idea was he would give every family $5,000 a year, just straight up. And the idea was you take the money from the rich, any income earned over $5 million would be confiscated by the government. So the maximum amount of money a person could earn in America is $5 million. Father Charles Coughlin, his was to nationalize the banks because he blamed the Jews for the Great Depression and owning the banks. Now, what made him a scary person because what was the fact that he had a radio audience of millions of people that were listening to his anti-Semitism as if it was a truth. A more benevolent person was Dr. Francis Townsend out of Long Beach, right? His idea was Social Security, which the FDR is actually going to implement, right? And his idea was $200 a month for all elderly people. The only stipulations you had to spend the money. Now, those are the liberals. Now, on the other side, conservatives and Republicans, they were also against the New Deal, right? And why would Republicans be against the New Deal? Okay. And if you can think of a European example that proves the Republican point of view. And for Republicans, they didn't like the New Deal because it was making government larger and started bordering on socialism, right? Republicans have always believed in laissez-faire. They believe that businesses and corporations should be at the core because they're the ones that give people jobs, right? And at this time, Europe was also in an economic crisis, and the response in Europe was far more involved than the New Deal was, right? In Italy and Germany, they turned to fascism. And in Russia, they turned to communism. So most Americans, they thought the New Deal was actually an appropriate balance between government intervention and the private sector. Now, the first New Deal didn't solve anything. In fact, we went into another depression in the mid 30s again. And to get out of it, there was a second New Deal. And in this one, this is where you get Social Security, which is arguably one of the most successful and popular government agencies or organizations in American history, which gives elderly people in America a pension for the rest of their lives so grandma never goes starving. But you also have the WPA, right? And this built roads, airports, right? Construction projects. It also put people to work, right? But a lot of these infrastructure projects were things that cities needed, like you can see in the upper left-hand corner, building a subway, building a bridge, building sidewalks, okay? Like the WPA, there's the PWA. Just notice the difference in the lettering, okay? And the PWA was infrastructure on really large projects. You see them in the upper left-hand corner. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, this was a Great Depression New Deal project by the PWA. And the Grand Coulee Dam, right, in the lower right corner there, right? That was the largest man-made structure in the history of the world. In fact, it still was until the Yangtze Dam was finished in China in the mid 80s, right? Now, what's the long-term impact of the WPA and PWA going to be? Was it worth the government spending billions of dollars on these projects? And also the fact that the government had to borrow money in order to do this. The government doesn't have money. They're just borrowing money to do this. And the answer is this was worth it because this major infrastructure was now in place to help the country grow after the Depression. One day the Depression is going to be ended, and America still needs to do the business of business, right? And we're going to need sidewalks to walk on, and trucks will need bridges to get across. And the Grand Coulee Dam is going to provide water to the whole Northwest United States, as well as electricity to Portland and Seattle. So when this Great Depression is over, these infrastructure projects will be the fundamental of the American economy in the future. Now, where does America get this money from? And that's called actually Keynesian economics. Okay. And this is a brand new type of economics at the time that basically said that the government should play a major role in the economy. And actually, it should involve itself in deficit spending. Just keep spending money, government. The government's not going to go anywhere. The government gets money from Americans paying taxes. And as long as there are Americans in jobs, there will be taxes. The government might not be able to pay stuff back today, but it can pay it back over time, right? I mean, it's a good example of it is today. People say it's not good to go into debt, but how do you buy a house? And people get a 30-year loan on the house. And the idea is after 30 years, you can pay back something that is an incredibly expensive investment. Oh, And when you're done, actually, that home will probably be worth more money. So it's an investment. It's the same thing here with Keynesian economics. The government just gets out there and spends money, and over time, the government will make that back with more goods being sold, right? And also, the government can create demand by becoming a major purchaser, right? The government can buy from companies to help the economy grow. Now, this is important in what I said earlier. Keep this in mind. Looking at the two charts above, right, identify what the federal government could have done to end the Depression earlier. The New Deal did not end the Depression. It just kept people from starving and rioting, okay? What ended the Depression, you can see on the up there, is World War II. Government spending, wow, quintupled is what it did, okay? Now, obviously, what could the government have done? It could have spent more money, okay? But why could the government not do that in the 1930s? Well, obviously, you can see in the 1930s, and this, right, is that some people were against the government spending too much money. So there had to be a balance between, how far the government can go, right? What changed, why the government could spend 5 times more money, is in World War II, we were actually in an existential crisis where the survival of the country was unsure. And the Great Depression, okay, we're trying to get through it. As long as people aren't burning stuff, we're okay. In World War II, the Japanese are bombing Americans and burning stuff. We've got to win and fight this war, otherwise we all die. So the government it didn't matter anymore. If there is no America, there's no one to pay it back. So government spending in World War II changed because Americans thought that that's what we needed to actually survive and win the war. Now, FDR, his biggest mistake he made was his court packing scheme. And what he tried to do here is he tried to add 7 judges to the Supreme Court. Okay. So he's changing the Supreme Court from 9 justices to 15 justices, right? And the idea is if he could get there was 2 Democrats and 7 Republicans on the Supreme Court. So he would have the majority of the court to support his plans, right? Now, Americans said this was a mistake because what he's doing is he's tinkering with the Constitution. This is the executive branch getting involved in telling the judicial branch how it should do its business, right? And remember, at this time, there were other dictators in the world like Hitler, or Mussolini or Stalin, right? And here is an attempt or grab for power by FDR that's gone beyond what any other president had ever done. Now, you have to think, though, analyze, why did FDR feel he needed to change the makeup of the Supreme Court in the first place, right? Why did he think the Supreme Court might not agree with FDR's New Deal, right, and his attempts to fix the economy? Why was the Supreme Court his target? And the answer to this, you have to understand, is that Republicans have dominated the presidency since the Civil War. There's only been 2 Democratic presidents before FDR since the Civil War: Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson, right? So the Supreme Court had 7 Republican justices, and these Republican justices serve for life. And remember, we said that Republicans are against the New Deal because it borders on socialism. And the fear was that if the Supreme Court shot down the first New Deal agencies in a test, then all the other New Deal agencies would be dissolved. So FDR saw this as the only way, or a way to try to make his New Deal agencies work, right? Now, what ended up happening is when this conflict went down, both sides understood that they had to make concessions. FDR recognized he can't change the Supreme Court and tinker with it. Um, that was an abuse of power. But at the same time, the Supreme Court started recognizing that those Republicans were like, well, we just can't be laissez-faire today. The future of the world and the role of government is to get somewhat involved. So the Supreme Court started supporting some of FDR's policies and allowed them to go through. Which brings us to now the New Deal. What is important about FDR and the New Deal and the Great Depression is not the fact that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. It did not. Okay. World War II ended the Great Depression. So what did the New Deal do for America? It basically changed the concept of government in the United States, where government is no longer laissez-faire when it deals with the good of the people. The government's job is not just to protect your life, liberty, and property. It's to make sure that you have a decent, fair standard of living, right? And the government will be a safety net when people are in need. Now, the reason why this is important is, I want you to think, can you identify up above me are 2 presidents, 2 of my favorite presidents, right, that are a legacy of the New Deal. But what are some of these legacies that you want to understand? Well, you have Harry Truman. And he had the Fair Deal, and Truman came right after FDR. And in his Fair Deal, Truman tried to increase the minimum wage. He tried to increase Social Security. He even proposed a national health care system where health care became a right, not an insurance policy. John F. Kennedy, you can see him there in the upper left-hand corner, right? He had an idea called the New Frontier, and his idea was the space program. We're not just we're gonna have the government get involved and get a man on the moon by the end of the decade, right? A Peace Corps, Americans going overseas to try to help others out. JFK was the first president that got involved in the civil rights movement, right, to protect those civil rights of African Americans in the South. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, is probably the predecessor of, not predecessor, sorry. His hero. He is a protege of FDR. Johnson's hero, and he becomes president after Kennedy in the 1960s, right? Johnson's hero was FDR. He became a congressman the same year FDR became president. And it is going to be Johnson that's going to create the Great Society, which is basically the New Deal on steroids, where he took government programs, and those government programs are still part of America today. He declared a war on poverty. He created Medicare, which is health care for the elderly. He created Medicaid, which is health care for the poor. He created Head Start, which is free preschooling for some Americans. I know some students probably went to Head Start. Okay, so the government from now on is going to be there to help people in need. And with that, guys, that is it for today. Thank you very much, and catch you later.